I hope you're all taking your early years seriously. I know that looking back, had I taken my academics into consideration, had I spent more time investing in my skills and passions, had I been more involved in extracurricular activities, I know that I would have set myself up better for the future. And of course, I definitely won't be the only person in your lives, the first or the last, to talk to you about investing in your youth and your livelihood. So today I'd then like to maybe perhaps provide even a small portion of you with a bit of guidance as to how you might want to manage your future expectations. Today I'm verging on my mid-20s and I'm more resolved than ever to exceeding the expectations that I'd in ill faith placed upon myself many years before. And this all comes down to choices. Choices mark the line between progress and regression, but I've come to the conclusion in my most recent times that it's your choices, the choices of the youth today, that will not only impact how you, as your individual selves, will move forward, but how we, as a society, as a people, will move forward as well. Today's youth literacy averages at around 91%. Had you looked back some 50 years, a fourth of the youth population lacked even basic literary skills. It's a resounding statistic, and it's kind of a monument to the way that education has been pushed for the youth, at least in terms of the provisions for it. So within these platforms of discourse, I'd like to then highlight two that resonate with me: politics and the environment. Now, because I'm a student of international relations, it's a core part of our curriculum to understand the relationship between countries and its people, its citizens and residents. Now, when it comes to the relationship between these things, it's important to understand how the youth are subjected to the country itself. Youth are important, at least when it comes to their participation, in influencing state policy, and that's never been more emphasized than it is today. Because while the youth are important for moving countries towards democracies, they're not nearly as prevalently represented in voting and governmental parties. But that's not to say that the youth have not made an impact or that there has not been an impact for the youth. You only need to look towards institutions like the Interparliamentary Union and their efforts to bolstering participation for youth parliamentarians in the expression of their views and ideologies towards global issues and otherwise. Or even here in the UAE, with the establishment of its 12th cabinet of the federal government overseeing youth affairs. These things are happening today, and they're happening quickly. That's why I'm speaking in hopes today that maybe even a small few of you in the audience would look towards these options as choices that you might want to make, because that starts here, and it can start with us. So in the previous summer, I was provided with the opportunity to intern for an environmental NGO called the Emirates Environmental Group, or EEG. In my time there, I was able to observe how they operated and what their functions were like. The EEG ethos surrounds this idea that education is by and far the most important part of spreading environmental awareness. So in my second week interning there, I was glad to be able to observe that for myself. The EEG hosts an annual awarding ceremony where they sort of highlight the recyclable contributions made by academic institutions, corporations, and individuals not unlike some of you in the crowd today. And I'd like to preface that I haven't always been environmentally conscious. So what I was able to see there, you see kids, some older than 12, maybe 13 years old, sharing the stage and acclaim with, these schools and corporations that, mind you, have greater means of making these collections in the first place. It left me in some ways quite moved, and in others quite infuriated, because they made it look so easy. Of course, I'm sure it isn't, but they proved that it's not an impossibility. And I desperately want for something like that to be recognized on an even grander scale. You know, the premise for change shouldn't have to be complex, but I think it should inspire. And we're in a time in our lives where discussions like these are important to have. So, when it comes to the subject of politics, in my final year in university, I was given the opportunity to assist one of my colleagues, or a few of my colleagues, in the formation of a model organization that would pull participants from all across the UAE. Think something along the lines of an MUN, but with the subject matter being on the United States and its Congress. We would go on to call it the AUS Model Congress. Now, a show of hands, how many of you have participated in conferences like the MUN or the Model Congress? Yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of you who've raised your hands have fond memories of either being observant or active participants of these conferences. I know I do. Politics is a funny thing, not so much for what it is, but for how it can be interpreted. It's begged me to consider today's politicians, if I might speak somewhat broadly. It would seem that the more senior politicians might stick to their pre-existing ideologies and policies. It's the younger politicians who are looking and shouting for reform from the grassroots. And I was able to observe that in the 3 days that the conference ran, because there's nothing kind of more inspiring than seeing students with passions bursting at the seams, to find common ground between feuding parties, to find consensus. And these are just students expressing the ideologies of their representations in order to find common ground. And of course, it goes without saying, the politics of the US or other countries are not one and the same, but I know it's merit enough to believe that there is hope for reform in some shape or form, because I've seen what a student with a voice can do. It provokes a sort of premise that I'd like to consider, in that, if we are just students playing roles in committees, trying to form policy and legislation, and coming to consensus and common ground on these issues, can we not ask more of those who might represent us, whoever they may be? Because that starts here, and it can start with us. The educational opportunities provided today for those young and unlike yourselves should land commitment on a more grander scale. And we can see that today, with the UN Sustainable Development Goals having a primary objective of pushing through education to many of those who may be underprivileged to receive those kind of merits. This needs greater representation, and will only be heard from those who may have the greater authority to speak on this issue. Which is why I would hope at the end of the day that even a small few of you might consider going into these sorts of topics, because we need those young and unlike yourselves, to push through with ideas that we might not necessarily have today. Because while I may not necessarily have all the answers, I would hope that in due time we might be able to come to realizing change together. The examples that I provided today are quite biased, and they lean towards my own objective perceptions of reality, but I would hope so that even a small few of you might consider making some sort of gesture towards contributing to the future. Because though we might not necessarily be the catalysts of today's most prevalent issues, we may yet hope to be the catalysts of tomorrow's changes. And if not for ourselves, then for the generations to come. Because it starts here, and it starts with us. Thank you.